welcome to Archetype. So for those of you who don't know who I am, my name's Joseph. Whoa. My name's Joseph. I'm the youth intern here. I've been the youth intern for about 3 months now, but I've actually been coming to Archetype for a pretty long time, about a little over 3 years. I have 2 younger brothers, Bozo's Ben and Sam, and then I have an older sister, Isabel. Some of you guys may know her. Yeah. And if you know a lot about me, you might know that I like to travel a lot. So last year, my school had a program called Summit, which was kind of like an outdoor leadership program where we did a bunch of trips and where we went to, our first trip was a 5-day canoe trip in the middle of the ocean. And fun fact about me, I actually despise the ocean. I think it's disgusting, I'm sorry. Like all the little sea creatures on the ground, I think it's just gross. I think it's gross. Anyways, so we went on a 5-day canoe trip, and I thought it was gonna be the worst time. So on the 3rd day, we stopped at this island called the Kermi Islands in the middle of the ocean. And when we got there, our teacher's like, hey guys, I think after we unpack, we should go for a swim. And I'm like, no, because on the way in the canoes, there was like a whole bunch of yucky stuff in the water. There's a whole bunch of yucky stuff. So I was like, nope, I'm good. But they forced me to go anyways. So I was just like this much deep in the water. It was so cold because the water's cold in the ocean. And then our teacher saw an island about 50 meters away, a little rocky shore island. And he's like, guys, I think we should swim to that island to go mini cliff jumping. I was terrified for my life. I'm no, I'm good. I'm gonna stay right here. But they forced me to go anyways. So after we got to this island, I was already shivering because I was terrified and it was super cold. And then our teacher's like, hey guys, who's gonna go first? I was standing right near the ledge and they pushed me off. But I actually ended up having a lot of fun during this trip. But when I had to take that first step to go, I was terrified. In the middle of this experience, I was just terrified to take that first step. Taking that first step out of my comfort zone wasn't really like me. Maybe some of you here are like me too. We're so scared to take that first step. And we say to ourselves, it's not even gonna be worth it. Going on trips like this, taking that risk, it's not even gonna be worth it. And a lot of us would probably just stay in our comfort zones. Or just because we're too uncomfortable to get out of it, or maybe we're just too scared. Are we like this with God? When God puts you in an uncomfortable situation, how do you respond? Maybe you run away because you want nothing to do with it, or you try hiding hoping it will just pass over your head. Or maybe God isn't answering your prayers and you feel like God is just punishing you in the moment. When God puts you in a season of waiting and uncertainty, how do we respond? When challenges in life present themselves, what do we do? I very recently also went through a season of change and waiting too. I questioned God about it. God, why are you doing this to me? Why are you punishing me like this? And I wanted nothing to do with it. I didn't want to go through this new season of life. I just wanted to stay right where I was. And maybe you feel the same. Tonight we're going to be talking about when the season of waiting and change presents itself, we can ask the question why and how do we move forward with it? So if you think of some people in the Bible who went through a season of waiting, who comes to your mind first? For me, it comes to Moses and the Israelites. So Moses and the Israelites, a little backstory. So the Israelites were slaves to the Egyptians for 400 years. I have patience if my 30-second hot dog isn't made in time. Like, I would not be able to wait that long. And then right after they got out of slavery, they were put in the middle of the desert for even longer. Can you imagine what it must have been like to be in their shoes? Can you imagine what they felt against God in that situation? We're also going to be talking about Moses and the Israelites' story and what we can learn from them what not to do. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you guys a question. When someone hurts you, what is your first response? I don't know about you, but I would definitely not be happy with it. I'd be wanting to take revenge, or I'd want to get back at them some way so that they can't just get away with this. You might feel the same about that, and everyone I know goes through something like that too. Do you know what Jesus has to say about this? Jesus says to turn the other cheek and have humility? What? No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be nice to this person who hurt me. I don't want to do this. And everyone in their lives has the same approach like that. And humility does not come easy to anyone. But when God gives challenges in life, we might respond the same way too. But when that happens, we shouldn't respond with that mindset. The mindset we should come in with is to humble ourselves towards God's plan and our will, which also leads me to my first point of tonight. Humble yourself before God. So before we get into this, let's have a little backstory on Moses. So if you don't know who Moses is, Moses was born in the time of Exodus, where this is the time where the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 years. And during this time, the Israelites actually outnumbered the Egyptians. So all the Egyptians were really scared, and Pharaoh ordered that all the male babies at the time be killed. But Moses' family actually saved him, and he was found by Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's daughter actually took him in, and he was living in the palace as a prince of Egypt. That must have been pretty cool, right? So Moses had so much power and control in his life. But one day when Moses was really older, he saw that one of his fellow Israelites were getting hurt by the Egyptians. He saw how bad the Egyptians were hurting the Israelites. So what Moses did is, out of anger, he actually killed the Egyptian, and then he ran into the desert. He ran into the desert. Okay, let's take a step back at this. Can you imagine that type of change? He went from being someone with so much power and control, he basically was almost second in command in the entire region of Egypt. He basically had anything he could want whenever he wanted that. And then he became a person of nothing in the wilderness. Can you imagine how hard that must have been on him? He didn't just lose it all. He lost his very identity. He lost his purpose in life. Such a dramatic change must have left him lost. Is this something you could kind of relate to? If it is, I understand what you're going through. I used to serve at my church and preachings, and I teach classes there quite often. And I dare to say my heart was prideful about it. My mind must have been in God, but my heart was misplaced. And I served for the wrong reasons, and I refused to see why. And because of that, God had to humble me to put me on the right path again. And with my sudden moving of churches, it's been so hard for me to accept the fact that I wasn't living for God, but I was living for my pride and I was living for myself. And the way I responded to God when he put me in the situation of waiting proved that. I was lost. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know how to take this challenge on. And it took me a while to see why God put me in this situation. But in the end, God opened my eyes to what I was actually doing, and he set me back on the right path because he humbled me. To see God's plan, we need to humble ourselves towards God. And if we don't humble ourselves, God is going to humble us, which isn't a fun experience. And the Bible tells us this in Luke 14:11. Luke 14:11 says, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Humility isn't just an external display of modesty. It's not just an external display. It's the inward position of the heart, acknowledging that we don't have what it takes to get through in life. We don't have the willpower to do it. And it surrenders our independence to God. It involves surrendering our will and our pride and our self-sufficiency to God's authority. And the Bible talks about this a lot. The Bible says that God values a humble heart. And the Bible also warns against the dangers of pride. And if we have pride in our lives, they consider it as a stumbling block in your faith and your spiritual growth. When individuals exalt themselves, putting them above everything else and above God, it often leads to a sense of distance from God. I would picture a season of waiting like fog. Like you're in the middle of a path and you can't see what's in front of you. But do you know what humility does? Humility almost lights up the path. Humility shows us which way to go. Okay, but still, Joe, why do I have to go in a season of waiting? Why does God have to do this to me? Well, whether we like it or not, we all go through a season of waiting. We all go through this. But the question we shouldn't be asking is, why is God doing this to me? The question we should be asking is how I could prepare myself for when this happens. Humility is about letting God take control in your life and letting go. It's letting God use us in the midst of our struggles. It's hard to let go of a life that you love. But doing that and letting God take control will make the journey so much easier when the time of waiting presents itself. And because of this, we actually might get angry with God. We may not want that change. We may not want to leave our comfort zone. And we might get angry with others and with God because of that. I was so upset with God when he moved me into my season of waiting. And there was a time where I could have saw all the light in this. I could have saw what came better of this. But I actually chose to remain in darkness because I refused to see that there was any good in this. I let my own emotions, I let my heart be unguarded. It's important that in our season of waiting, in our time of waiting, not to get angry with God or with others. It's important to not let our hearts get corrupt, and it's important to guard our hearts. That leads to the second point of today. The Bible reminds us that it is crucial to guard our hearts. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." And the last part of this verse reminds us why it's so important. Everything we do, every single action, every single word we say flows from the condition of your heart. If your heart is dry and is full of anger, that's what you're going to reflect. That's what you're going to show. So even the people of the Israelites show how this is true. So if we go back to Moses, after a few years, Moses eventually takes the Israelites out of Egypt with God's help, and he brings them to Mount Sinai. So at Mount Sinai, Moses tells the people just to wait at the foot of the mountain while Moses goes up to talk to God and eventually get the 10 Commandments. But the Israelites, they were so impatient with Moses and God. They're like, nope, I don't want to do this, so I'm just going to do what I want to do. So they gathered all their gold and they created their own god. They created a golden calf, something like that. Yeah, there we go. Something like that. They made their own idol because they didn't want to wait on God. They lent unto their own understanding. And they worshiped this cow because they didn't want to wait on God. Moses returned to see the people who misplaced their hearts and placed it into their idol that they made. They made this golden calf because waiting on God to follow through was taking too long for them, and it didn't seem viable to them. And they rejected God. Let me ask you this. What is the idol in your life? Do we tend to do this sometimes? Instead of humbling ourselves to God's will, we push our own thing. We get mad at God for making this come at us, so we place our trust in other things to make up for God's absence. You could go to the next slide, please. Does this happen to be your idol? You may be like, haha, Joe, this isn't my idol. I don't worship my phone. But maybe you do unconsciously. A reminder that an idol is whatever has the number one place in your life. Think about it. How much time do you spend worrying about media and about the world? How much time do you actually spend in the presence of God? When we don't guard our hearts in our season of waiting, our hearts can get easily corrupted and overrun. While the world offers us temporary satisfaction, God offers us eternal satisfaction. The world constantly throws us ways to make us worry or compare with others. And social media could actually be an idol because of that. We abandon our heart's defenses by lingering onto these worldly issues and problems. We worry about, when can I text that person back? And we have little time to even worry about God. Or maybe you try to distract yourself with work. Work for you is your idol. Sometimes you become so exhausted that you have little time to even worry about God. You have little time to think about God. Or maybe we let work consume us so much that we have little space to even think about God's just not a part of that. Or maybe pride in our situation and in our work lets us be blinded from God and makes us distant from him. Or maybe you're like me. You thought your heart was guarded at the time, but it actually wasn't. And then when that season of waiting comes for you, you have nowhere to lean on and you fall. Who we are on the inside will reflect who we are on the outside. If our hearts are placed in this world, we're going to reflect this world. And take a look at the world right now. Is this something you want to be known as? Is this something you want your heart to be? Sometimes to see God's plan, God needs to give us that little push. What happens when we don't guard our hearts is that when that little push comes, when the season of waiting comes, we blame and we hurt others, just like the people of Israel did. As soon as they went into their time of waiting, as soon as they had to wait on God, they leaned onto their own understanding and they rejected God. They leaned onto their idol and told God that they couldn't wait for them. God is just kind of a side point. Even today, unfortunately, we fall into this cycle. As soon as God puts us into our trials and in our waitings, we don't want anything to do with it. We get angry with God and upset at God for put us in a situation, and we lean onto our own understanding about what's good for us. And that's how I felt too. I was so angry with God and with my parents and with my friends that I pushed people away. I tried convincing myself that I would make my own change, that nothing is going to change because of God. I'm going to make this about me, and I will not let God change my life. I wish I saw that this wasn't the answer sooner. My life has felt so much fuller after I learned to let go. It was like a rush of peace came over my mind. And Jesus reminds us in the Gospel of John how it is so important, how the peace will come over if we guard our hearts in Jesus. John 14:27 says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives, but as I give to you. Do not let your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." Jesus is saying that his peace and putting our hearts and trust into him is better than anything the world can offer us. It's important to constantly check your heart. Is your heart in the place of an idol right now? Our season of waiting can sometimes even feel a bit useless too. We feel like we don't actually need it. Who here has felt useless before? Everyone has at least felt useless once. Thank you, Jason. I know I certainly have felt useless. Sometimes I feel like the work we do isn't actually worth it. It's not worth pursuing. And we say to ourselves, I just want to go back to how everything was and how there was no problems and that I didn't have to do this useless task. That's something I've said too. It's important to remind ourselves that God gives our work purpose even if it doesn't feel like it. Maybe right now your work does feel useless. The work that you have been tasked to do in your season of waiting feels useless. And the thing God told you to do has no purpose and you just want to go back to where everything was fine. Restoring that bond won't fix anything, or telling your parents that something is up, it won't do anything good. There's no good in that. Or trying to communicate that something is wrong in your life to your friends, or even doing manual labor for your dad in a church feels like nothing and useless. Maybe you feel useless and that God can't use you in this stress and in this time. People tell me all the time, Joe, give it to God, he'll fix it. But I would say, yeah, I will, and then nothing will change. I'll pray about it, and then nothing will change. All this hard work can feel like it doesn't serve a purpose. The new work given to you feels like just useless, and you don't want to do it, and it doesn't serve a purpose. The new season of your life feels useless. All right, let's pretend for sake that this is a shepherd's staff. It isn't a broom, this is a shepherd's staff, all right? So does this staff serve a purpose, a shepherd's staff? This useless shepherd's staff today, does this serve a purpose? No, it doesn't. It looks like an ordinary piece of wood. It looks kind of useless and dull. Let's just say that this represents life in the ordinary and in the dull. Let's say this life is useless and dull. If we go back a few years to when the start of Moses' journey began, Moses ran away from home and out of fear because he felt like he's going to be judged for what he did. So he ran into the wilderness and he became a shepherd for his father-in-law's sheep. The shepherd staff, represents the ordinary and the dull life. The life of the shepherd, it kind of feels like a useless job, right? When you think about it, you kind of watch sheep. That seems so interesting. But just as this staff served a purpose with Moses, our work sometimes can almost feel a little bit dull and routine and lacking in significance. You might serve in or work in an area that isn't high profile, or it isn't worshiped, isn't celebrated. Our efforts can sometimes feel undervalued and unnoticed. You want to be noticed and you want to know that what you're doing in the end is actually worth it, but you just feel like it won't be, and you feel so dull. Maybe like Moses, you didn't have a high profile job, or you weren't noticed for the things that you did. Maybe once you did. Maybe once you were high profile. You felt like you had everything under control. You felt like you had a happy life and you didn't want anything to change. Then all of a sudden that change comes and you're back at the bottom again and you just want things to go back to normal. Moses, a former prince of Egypt who basically had everything, became kind of a useless kind of shepherd. His royal status actually transitioned into a season of humility. Maybe once you had friends in your past life, you had a purpose, and then just in the blink of an eye, it's gone. It's important to know that waiting is not a passive experience, but it's an active season of change in your life made by God. Moses may have felt useless as a shepherd, but did you know this is how it actually all started for him? It was in the wilderness, as Moses tended to flocks of sheep, that God chose that very moment to reveal himself to him. It was in this moment, with his staff in hand, that God chose to reveal himself through a burning bush. This staff once used a tool for beating up sheep and dogs. God used it as a guiding point in Moses' life. God used the ordinary task, the bland task, as a divine backdrop for God. Maybe right now you're wandering through the wilderness. In the wilderness, Moses encountered isolation. He encountered challenges and a sense of displacement. And we all encounter these seasons of life where our surroundings are unfamiliar. When God feels distant, or when life is at a point of uncertainty, it's important to trust God that he will turn those moments into something beautiful. Sometimes accepting God's timing can be hard. During this time, it's so important to know that your work is valued by God. This is not a useless thing you're doing. God has put you into this time at a perfect time for his purpose. I thought I had a purpose before God put me into my season of waiting. And then God prepared a change in my life, not just in my life, but in my heart. My new church, it was hard for me to accept as God's plan for me. But I have such a greater and stronger faith in God because of it. What seemed like a punishment to me, God turned it into a blessing. And if I had the chance to take it back, I would never take it back. Hearing God will change your life can sometimes be hard to hear. Maybe you don't want to follow through on God, or you just don't have the motivation to do that. God will use your actions for a greater purpose only if you allow him to do so. You have to put 100% of your faith into him. And with that, this takes me to the big idea of tonight, which is basically just a summary of what we've been talking about. To accept God's timing, we need to learn to rely on God. I'm going to invite the band back up. We all want important things to happen to our life. We all want these good things to happen to our lives, right? But too often, we're not willing to wait for them. We want them now. We don't want them later. And when that doesn't happen, we have the temptation to ask, God, when is this happening? I want it now, God. Most of us need to grow in the area of trusting God instead of focusing on the when question. If you're missing joy and peace, if you feel like your life has a chunk taken out, you're not trusting God. Sometimes it's hard to accept this fact, and we try to figure and live everything out on our own. If you're like this with God, going through a time of uncertainty will be hard. And I learned this the hard way. I didn't have the faith to trust God through my season of change. But when we say, God, I can't figure this out on my own. God, I choose to trust you and I choose to let you in. We can have a peace of mind through the midst of the storms. Trusting God often requires not knowing how God is going to do that or when God is going to bring change. He uses these times to stretch our faith in him. We spend a lot of time in our lives in change because change is a process. It doesn't happen immediately. I have many people tell me, Joe, I want change, but they aren't willing to go through that change. They're not willing to wait for that change. I have people tell me all the time that they want that so bad, but the truth is we're all gonna have to wait. The question is, are you gonna wait the wrong way or are you gonna wait the right way? If we wait the wrong way, we're gonna be miserable. If we depend on ourselves and think, we got this, we're gonna fall and be miserable. But But if we decide to wait God's way, we can become patient and enjoy the time of waiting. It takes practice, but as we let God help us in each situation, we develop this patience. And it's only developed under trial, so we mustn't run from these situations. James 1:4 says, "Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." As we develop patience, the Bible says that we feel complete, completely satisfied, lacking nothing. Even our relationship with God takes progressive changes. I would not have the faith I did a year ago if I wasn't put in these situations. We learn to trust God by going through the experience that requires trust. God causes things to happen exactly at the right time. Your job is not to figure out when, not to figure out how, but to make up your mind that you're gonna follow him through the midst of everything, and you won't give up until you cross that finish line. Learning to trust God's timing, it requires three things. It requires having the humility to let go of our prideful lives, to let God take control. It requires guarding our hearts, not to lean onto these worldly things or onto our idols, but to give it fully to God and let God be the provider. And it requires knowing that God will use you for the best, even if a point of your life feels useless. The Lord reminds us to endure and trust in him in Isaiah. Isaiah 40:31 says, "But they who wait in the Lord shall renew their strength, and they shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint." The Lord reminds us to wait for his plan. For those who follow him and trust him with true faith may not be growing weary, but will have the strength to follow through. Maybe for you right now, waiting feels impossible. You feel like, I can't do it. You've tried your best, but you'll just, drop it. You've tried to wait for God to follow through, but he just isn't there. I'm here to remind you to keep enduring. I know from experience that God will follow through. I'm living proof of it. But today, I even still struggle with trusting God through the midst of my storms. I don't know what God is going to do in your life. I don't know what he's going to do in mine. But I do know that God is here for you, even if it doesn't feel like that. He is here to bring you joy and peace at the end of the tunnel. Maybe it doesn't feel like that right now, but I encourage you to keep following through and keep fighting. And for those that are having a hard time to even understand what I'm saying, you've heard of this joy and peace before, but you've never actually experienced it. If you want what I'm talking about today, if you want that joy and peace, I encourage you to pray this prayer with me. If you feel this stir in your heart and you finally want to let go of that pain and struggle that you've been dealing with, please pray this prayer with me.